Today on Blue 58, the Packers send one defensive back to injured reserve and add another via waivers. How are they going to get them all on the field? Is it even possible? Let's discuss. Then we'll be joined by a special guest to help us get a little perspective on what the Denver Broncos could be bringing to Lambeau Field this Sunday.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to Blue 58, the one and only podcast to thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, Jon Meerdink. Happy to be with you here for another episode. Glad a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and dive right in. The Packers making some roster moves this week. One of them kind of a bummer. Raven Green is headed to injured reserve, had an ankle injury in Sunday's win over the Minnesota Vikings, and it looks like he could be out for a while. Conservative estimates look like 10 weeks. Sounds like he may have to have some surgery, which is just really too bad because he was both a good player and a really good story dating back to last year, making the roster undrafted out of James Madison. And it looked for all the world like he was going to be playing a big role for the Packers on defense this year. And it's not clear in the short term how the Packers are going to replace him. Ibrahim Campbell is still a ways off on the PUP list. And if the Packers are looking for someone to play that sort of hybrid linebacker role, I'm not sure that player is on the roster right now. I'm not sure they have somebody who can slide in there quite as easily as Raven Green. Although Josh Jones is still out there on his couch someplace. So if they really need somebody, they could see if he's changed his mind about being willing to do that kind of job. That is a joke. I don't think that's actually going to happen. But a bummer, Raven Green, on his way to injured reserve. Tremont Smith is coming in to take his place on the active roster. Functionally, the Packers replace Raven Green with Smith, taking the roster spot vacated by Green, moving to injured reserve. Smith, pretty good-sized guy, 6 feet tall, 190 pounds, out of Central Arkansas, sixth-round pick of the Kansas City Chiefs last year, 2018. Central Arkansas, little tiny school. Go Bears, by the way. Google their football field. You will like this. It's pretty wild. Trust me, just look it up. Smith, another high-test athlete for Brian Gutekunst. 4.4 range in the 40. Pretty solid numbers elsewhere among his measurables. Thought of as a corner, but mainly a kick returner and kick coverage guy. He averaged just under 27 yards per kickoff return on 33 returns last year. Did not return a punt. The Chiefs tried him a little bit on offense over the summer, a little bit at running back and a little bit at wide receiver. That's something that you do with really athletic guys when you're not really sure what they are. And I tend to think that's more an indictment of his football talents than praise. If he could do one thing well, he'd probably be doing that for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he'd probably be doing it right now. Instead, he's available and now in Green Bay. But I do think there's a fairly good chance he could be here for a bit. Pretty good size speed combo. 6 foot, 190 pounds is not too bad for a defensive back. Not too bad for, say, like a punt gunner, something like that. He did play 74 snaps on defense for Kansas City last year. He also played nearly 200 on special teams, 196 to be exact. That reminded me of another sort of snap profile that the Packers added over the offseason. Chandon Sullivan played 87 snaps on defense in Philly as kind of a bit player last year, but just 53 on special teams. So they're kind of different models of the same player, Sullivan and Smith. Both lower-end cornerbacks, both will do spot duty on defense and play some special teams. The difference is Sullivan is going to lean a little bit more toward defense, and Smith is going to lean a lot more towards special teams. That brings us to the final point here I want to make before we jump into our topic with our special guest. The Packers have a lot of corners right now. In fact, you could say the Packers roster looks like an octagon right now because they've got 8 corners. Please enjoy that very, very cheesy joke. That's a lot of corners. That's not going to last, and you can even argue that there's more corners with Will Redmond playing safety. He came into the league as a corner, though he's probably officially now and forever a safety now. 8 corners is not going to last. This is pretty unusual, and even 7 is on the higher end. So something's going to give here. Who's it going to be? When is it going to happen? I'm not sure, and I'm not really sure if we can speculate on it either. There's been a lot of people who have talked about Josh Jackson heading out of town in like a trade for Minkah Fitzpatrick or something like that. That's not going to happen. Fitzpatrick is on his way to Pittsburgh, but it is interesting that he has not played a whole lot this year. He was banged up in the preseason and training camp, but even so, you'd think he'd play a little bit on defense, just get out there for a snap or two. It really hasn't happened. Something's going to give here sooner or later. We're going to figure out the real number of corners the Packers need. It's not 8. Something's going to give, and it's probably going to happen pretty soon. I said I don't know in there a couple times, and I'm going to use that as my segue into the next little bit that I want to talk about here. I think one of the most honest things you can say is, I don't know. I try to say that when it is honestly the case about football stuff. When I'm doing this podcast, I try to stick, honestly, as much as I possibly can to things that I do know, or things that I'm at least confident about, and then let other people explain what I don't. And then we've got one of those situations today. The Packers play the Broncos on Sunday. Vic Fangio is the new head coach of the Denver Broncos, and Vic Fangio has given Aaron Rodgers all kinds of trouble over the years, first as the defensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers, and then as the coordinator for the Bears the last couple of years. How does he do it exactly? I don't really know, but I know someone who does. Jeff Essary writes for MileHighReport.com, the Denver Broncos SB Nation blog. He's been doing some pretty extensive breakdowns on Fangio's defense prior to his time now in Denver and what it's looked like with the Denver Broncos now, plus just an overview of how it all works. He was kind enough to join me for a few minutes earlier today, so we're going to give you that conversation right now. Here's Jeff Essary of MileHighReport.com breaking down the Denver Broncos defense with me. I'll be back shortly with some more stuff on the Packers.
Blue 58, hut!
So, Jeff, just to start, I want to rewind kind of to the offseason. Even though we're heading into week 3, I want to go back a couple months. There were a ton of offensive head coaches that filled available gigs this offseason. So you had people like Matt LaFleur, for example, in Green Bay, really offensive background. But the Broncos, with their head coaching vacancy, go in about as different a direction as you can. What was your first thought when you found out they'd be hiring Vic Fangio?
I think the very first thought is potentially one that other fans had as well, is wanting to go in that direction of, the younger head coach, maybe more offensive minded, specifically because of, how poor Denver's offense has been in the past several years, and really wanting them to innovate on the offensive side. And so after, seeing Gary Kubiak come along, even though he, was very successful in Denver and taking him to the Super Bowl, but after, you had John Fox, Gary Kubiak, and then, a younger guy in Vance Joseph, but a defensive-minded head coach, I think fans were really looking for maybe somebody a little younger and on the offensive side, kind of keeping up with the league trends. And so my first reaction to hearing, Vic Fangio was, it wasn't the most positive, but I do believe after kind of digging in and, seeing what he's about, that he was one of the perfect fits for Denver. And I do think Denver did experience a little bit of, they were probably jumping to maybe swinging the pendulum the other way after a young rookie head coach in Vance Joseph went poorly. They went with, the really long established veteran with a proven track record. And, John Elway talked about wanting the next head coach to be an expert on one side of the ball, whether that was offense or defense. And Vic Fangio is certainly that, an expert on the defensive side of the ball and been in the league for, many years. And so I think it panned out. I came around to the idea as a fan. And then also I think what helped was the hiring of offensive coordinator Rich Scangarello. And so Denver got kind of a bit of best of both worlds, where you've got the defensive minded, head coach and, grizzled veteran in Vic Fangio, but then you also get the forward looking, innovative offensive mind in Rich Scangarello. At least that's what, the hope is from Denver fans, is that he'll be. And so they kind of scratched that itch a little bit in terms of the young offensive mind. And I think Denver fans have been happy, at least, throughout the offseason with Vic Fangio, and have really come around to the idea and like the fact that he's our guy.
You touched on a couple words there, 3 words in particular, on describing Vic Fangio that I think are important. Established, proven, expert. I think all of those describe Vic Fangio really well. If you're looking for a defensive head coach, that's pretty much the best you can get in a head coach candidate. What do you think has made him so successful in his career so far? What are the hallmarks of his defense?
I think one of the things, and he talked about it in his opening interview when he, with his introductory press conference for the Broncos, he talked about just the necessity of innovating on the defensive side and kind of keeping up, because defense is, inherently a reactive side of the ball. Really, you're reacting to the trends that are going on, and what the offense is doing. You're reacting to their personnel that they're putting out on the field, the different matchups that they're trying to throw at you. And so the ability to adapt as a defensive coordinator, I think, is something that Vic Fangio has shown, and he's really shown the ability to come in and stop some of these, the high flying offenses that have brought a lot of these innovative concepts. Last year, they were the ones, the Bears were really the ones that shut down the Rams offense. And, guys like Kyle Shanahan and the Sean McVays of the NFL haven't had a ton of success against Vic Fangio's defense. I think he's shown the ability to adapt and be flexible to the different types of offenses that he's faced, but then also kind of adapt his scheme to the modern, NFL on defense as he's gone along in his career. And he talked about that, in his introductory press conference, and it shows through on tape as well with what you see on the defensive side. And I think that's one of the big hallmarks of what makes him successful. But then also just, one of the themes of Denver's coaching staff this year is, and that Vic Fangio wants among all his staff, is that they be teachers, and that they really teach technique and teach the fundamentals of the game. And so I think that's another big piece of what makes Vic Fangio a good coach, is the ability to teach his scheme. And you see it pay out in the results. Specifically when he was with the Bears, you saw them, start, and he really built that defense from the ground up. And they brought in all new, fresh talent and kept adding guys every year. And every year they got incrementally better until what you see in 2018, and at that point they're entrenched in his system. And watching them on tape is, it's kind of a thing of beauty to see them all work together in concert, and the way they all play off of each other and the way they understand the scheme. And that's because of the way that, Vic Fangio's taught it. And so I think those are some of his strengths on the defensive side as a coach.
You talked about it a little bit there about working in concert and just some of the results you've seen from the Denver defense so far. Now, Denver's coming into this game 0-2, but just from an outside perspective, just a surface level look, it looks like it may not entirely be the defense's fault. They held the Raiders to just 24 points. They held the Bears to just 16, but still they're 0-2. What is the difference between the reputation of Vic Fangio and the results? And really, is it the defense that's falling short so far?
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make when I talk about what we've seen on tape, is specifically talking about the 2018 Bears and the way they played well together. And, the hope is for that to translate into the 2019 Broncos. So far, the results on the field have been, a little bit less than stellar. And you mentioned it, specifically with the Raiders. I think we saw a lot of miscommunication in the secondary, guys still trying to, figure out how they fit into the defense. And, also, the staff is kind of coaching around some injuries right now. Bryce Callahan is a guy who knows Vic Fangio's scheme. They brought him over from the Bears, and he was a long-time nickel corner for them, and came over to Denver with the intent of him playing, some significant time in the secondary. And he's been hurt for these first two games with a foot injury that's been kind of nagging him all offseason. So he hasn't practiced much, and he's been hurt. And so they've had to play some other guys there at corner, had to move Kareem Jackson down from, they really wanted to play him more at safety, and they played him at the nickel spot. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And then in the linebacker room, you've had Todd Davis, who is a, longtime vet for Denver over the last couple of years. He's played in their system there, and he's a leader on the team and in the locker room, and he's been out for these last couple games as well. And so I think what you saw the first two games from the Denver defense is not necessarily indicative of what we hope to see in the future. And I think they can grow into more of what Vic Fangio's vision is for the defense. But I think we saw some flashes in the Raiders game. Like I mentioned, there was a lot of, not a lot of good communication in the secondary, and the Raiders kind of picked on Isaac Yiadom, who was he's a young corner who came in and eventually had to play a lot more playing time than they probably anticipated because of the injury to Bryce Callahan, and the Raiders picked on him all game. From the very first snap, it was evident that they were going to be picking on him all game. And so, midway through that game, I broke it down on an article that I did for Mile High Report last week. During that game, they had to adjust their defense and kind of roll some coverage towards Isaac Yiadom, change up some of the way they were calling things specifically against trips, and the way they were isolating him on the backside of, those 3-by-1 sets, to really give Yiadom some help. And so I think once they got that ironed out, they stuck with that throughout the Bears game, and there was a lot better results from the defense in the Bears game. And, it wasn't talked about a ton after the Bears game because there's a lot more things to talk about in terms of, people were worried about, the lack of sacks from Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, and the lack of pressure, and the fact that the defense gave up a 4th and 15 for them to get down, at the end of the game to kick that winning field goal. But the defense actually played really well, and they improved. A key stat from that is they allowed the Raiders to convert 71% of their third downs. But against the Bears, they essentially inversed that, and they held them to 27% third down conversion rate. And that's a massive, improvement from week to week. And obviously the Bears don't have, the greatest offense, and Mitch Trubisky's struggled the last 2 weeks. But with that drastic of an improvement, it's not just all on the offense that you're playing. There was improvement in execution on the defensive side, and they improved in the running game as well, outside of a couple big busted plays on some, misdirection, wide receiver type plays. They held the Bears to, I think, 3.24 yards per carry, aside from a couple of those big busted plays that they did on the outside. And so the defense improved drastically, I think, from week 1 to week 2. And so it'll be really interesting, this next week as we go into the game against the Packers, because they've got, a really good offense that is much better than the Bears. And so it'll be a great test, I think, for Denver of this will probably be the litmus test of where they're at as a defense. They've had a little bit of time to shake the cobwebs off and scheme around potentially some of the injuries and the replacement guys that are in there. And actually, we may see Todd Davis and Bryce Callahan take the field against the Packers. And so at that point, I think this game will be a really kind of litmus test for what Vic Fangio is wanting to do for this defense. One other thing I'll say on that too is, it's going to take some time. And I don't think, even if Denver continues to maybe struggle a little bit on the defensive side, I don't think that's necessarily indicative of Vic Fangio and his coaching ability yet. Because if you think about, the defense they built in 2018 with the Bears, there was 9 of the guys on that defense were multi-year starters in Vic Fangio's system. The only new guys on the defense in 2018 were Khalil Mack and Roquan Smith, who are both, top shelf guys anyway. You plug them in and, they played excellent. But majority of those guys, of the starters on the 2018 defense, they had been with Vic Fangio for 3 years, and some of them for, 2 years. But so they've been entrenched in that system, and Denver, has barely had an off season with them. They've had some injuries, and they're in their first, 2 games. And so that's kind of been my message to the fans that are, maybe a little disappointed. And I was disappointed as well at the way the defense played that first game, especially because I was expecting a lot coming from Vic Fangio and all the stuff we had heard in the offseason. But I think taking a step back, you got to recognize it's going to take a little bit of time to really let this defense kind of gel. But to your point, they weren't the worst thing on the field either against the Bears in that loss on Sunday.
So let's talk about 2 pass rushers you mentioned there. The Broncos are in a really unusual position of not having a sack through the first 2 weeks of the season. Sacks aren't everything. I think most people understand that by this point. The average 2019 fan still probably wants to see them, but I think we're coming to an understanding that sacks aren't everything. But still, it's weird that they don't have any, especially with 2 top 5 picks at the position of edge rusher, especially one in Von Miller, who's been about as good as it gets since he joined the Broncos in 2011. But when it comes to Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, give us a quick rundown on what each of them does well. What should we be watching for Miller and Chubb on Sunday?
Yeah, a quick thing on the sacks, and to your point, sacks aren't everything, but Denver has also struggled a little bit to get pressure with those 2 edge guys. And so I think it has been a little bit surprising because from a reputation standpoint, I mean, those guys are Bradley Chubb had 12 sacks as a rookie, which is, pretty unprecedented. Von Miller, it beats Von Miller's rookie year, which was incredible as well. I think Bradley Chubb was, should have been in the running, or was in the running for defensive rookie of the year. And so he's a, great talent off the edge, and he's still going to continue to grow and get better. But what I actually have seen from Chubb, especially in the Bears game, was improvement in the run stopping department as well. He and Von Miller, even though they didn't get a lot of pressure against the Bears, were absolutely, stellar in the running game. And so, that's what both of those guys bring, is that versatility. They're not only going to pass rush you off the edge, but they can also shut things down in the running game. But in terms of not getting as much pressure, it's been a mix of, the way teams are playing Denver currently. They're playing them more conservatively, using the quick passing game, running the ball more. Vic Fangio talked about it in his press conference this week. Teams, the Raiders ran more than they passed. And if I'm remembering correctly on the way the Bears numbers split as well, they ran more than they passed. And that's, unprecedented in the league today. But that's just the way teams are choosing to play Denver, to try to neutralize those two guys, because they are coming at you. And so I think, again, to the overall point of maybe fans expecting a little too much or a little disappointed, I think we were really expecting those two guys to come out of the gate. And, you saw what Vic Fangio did with Leonard Floyd and Khalil Mack, and we expected that to just, really unleash Bradley Chubb and Von Miller on the league and Vic Fangio's defense. And it hasn't really panned out that way. But I don't think it's necessarily a reflection on those two guys and their talent, because at the end of the day, they're still the best, pass rushing duo in the league. And when you give them chances in third and longs, or the offense, gets a lead and the team has to try to come from behind, they're going to be coming after you.
Pass rushers get a lot of the headlines. The guys who get the interceptions get a lot of headlines too. But a lot of what makes a defense work is role players doing their job. That's one of the things that the Bears did really well with Vic Fangio last year. We got to see it twice against the Packers in the NFC North. They just had a lot of guys who showed up and did everything correctly. In Denver, there's probably some of those same guys. So who's an under-the-radar player on the Broncos defense that Packers fans should probably know about?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of them that you might hear their name called on Sunday. Shelby Harris on the defensive line. He's kind of jumped into that. It's kind of been a mix of that Eddie Goldman, Akeem Hicks role in Vic Fangio's defense, and he's played really well on the interior defensive line, and had some really good run stops against the Chicago Bears. In the secondary, Kareem Jackson is a guy that Denver brought over from the Texans, who spent most of his career at corner and moved to safety, and is kind of a versatile guy on the back end. And for Denver, he's played a little bit of safety and some nickel because of some of the injuries that they've experienced. But he was flying around the field. Both in the Raiders game and the Bears game, he's been as advertised. He can come up and play the run. He has great instincts. He's smart, and he fits perfectly into Vic Fangio's defense. He's versatile and has some great coverage ability. And so he and Justin Simmons both on the back end bring a lot of good versatility, and made some big plays against the Bears on Sunday. And so I think those are two guys, Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson, in the secondary, that Aaron Rodgers in the passing game will have to watch out for.
So we've been almost all offense, or all defense, so far. But let's flip to offense, because the Broncos made a notable move at quarterback this offseason. In fact, a couple of them. They moved on from Case Keenum, and they traded for Joe Flacco. What did you think of that move at the time, and has anything happened that would change your feelings one way or another since then?
I thought the move was the best that Denver was going to get at the position. And so I'm not super enthused. It doesn't sound very enthusiastic, because it's not. I don't think anybody was really, cheering the fact that Denver traded for Joe Flacco. I probably like him more than some folks, kind of after digging into the tape and the things that he brings to the table that we didn't have with Case Keenum. It doesn't mean I think that he's the answer, or that he can really, be the guy at quarterback, but I think he's the best we were going to get this season. And also recognizing the fact that it wasn't going to stop Denver from drafting a quarterback. he was the plan A, which he is for this season, but if he was the plan, for the future, then I think would have had some more problems with them bringing in Joe Flacco. But they also, dipped into the quarterback position in the draft and picked Drew Lock. And, a lot of people were saying they would still draft Drew Lock in the first round after having Flacco. And they ended up being able to pick him up in the second. And so, having Joe Flacco and a young quarterback to kind of groom behind him, I think is kind of the best of both worlds, where Denver gets a guy who, has won games, has experience, is a veteran at the position, and is probably the best that they were going to get in the offseason. And so from that perspective, I liked the move. And I think, Joe Flacco fits in well with what Rich Scangarello wants to do on the offensive side. He's a veteran guy on a team with a lot of young players on the offense. I think the only outside of Emmanuel Sanders, all the other, skill positions are still on their rookie contracts. Some of them are rookies and were rookies last year. You've got Cortland Sutton, Deshaun Hamilton, Noah Fant, Phillip Lindsay, Royce Freeman. All of those guys are first or second year players at the skill position. And so I think having a veteran guy at quarterback to really kind of command that group is key. And Joe Flacco brings that as well. And so, I thought he played well against the Bears as well. He had that untimely pick in the red zone, and they've got to, Denver's offense has to figure the red zone out. But overall, I think I haven't changed my feeling on bringing in Joe Flacco, and I wasn't super high on him, but I didn't hate the move, and I think it made sense at the time, and I think it still makes sense for Denver. And Joe Flacco's kind of the best that they were going to get at the position.
I'm really sympathetic to that position, and I think you kind of raise a good point there, because in 2019, if you don't have a quarterback, you don't really have anything. You're kind of punting on a season if you don't have a guy you're confident about as your starter. So if you think that you're not in a good position with the quarterback spot, you might as well go out and get the best one that you can get for right now. And if that's Joe Flacco, I guess that's Joe Flacco.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Denver hasn't been as lucky as Green Bay to be able to go from, one Hall of Famer to the next, and having Aaron Rodgers at the position. And you're absolutely right. They're kind of in that, middle ground after the Peyton Manning retirement, and they've been there for the last couple of years of finding who's going to be that next guy. And that's what, you typically see from teams after they lose a top flight quarterback. I think the Packers and potentially maybe the Cowboys are one of the other teams who have kind of lucked into getting, or lucked, or, skill as well in terms of drafting but been able to move from a solid quarterback position to another, young rookie guy that turned into somebody that would be the franchise guy. Everybody else kind of falls into that quarterback purgatory and kind of goes through the churn of that until they finally find their guy. And so, I think they're just in that churn, and that's just how it works. Elway takes a lot of criticism for not finding the guy. Some of it's warranted. They swung and they missed on Paxton Lynch. Who knows what'll happen with Drew Lock, but the quarterback position and being in that kind of quarterback churn is not unprecedented, and everybody in the league struggles with it. And so that's why we see people, when you have your guy, you hang on to him and pay him whatever he wants for them to stick around, because it is so valuable.
So before I let you go, I want to get your prediction for Sunday. I've seen a line as low as the Packers by 7 and a high as the Packers by 8.5. What would be your prediction for Sunday, Packers or Broncos?
I really want to predict a Broncos win, but I just don't think the way that they're playing right now that they can go into Lambeau and take on, Aaron Rodgers in that offense. But then also what we've seen from the defense from the Packers, that's been really impressive. Some of the guys that they brought over, Zadarius Smith off the edge, and then some of the young players in the secondary have been really impressive as well. Darnell Savage and Jair Alexander have been playing well for you guys as well. And so I think with the improved defense and Denver's struggles on offense, and then the defense will have its hands full with Aaron Rodgers. Anytime you play him, you have to be on your best game. And so I think Denver it'd kind of be a bit of a miracle for them to pull out a win on the road against this team, but I hope they make it competitive, and I hope they, show some improvement from the last couple weeks. And so I still think the Packers probably end up win by 2 scores, at least, maybe like 10 points or something. So I'm terrible at score predictions, and so I never give a final score, or if I do, it's always just way off. But I do think the Packers will end up, with the win. But I hope Denver makes it competitive and gives everybody a good game.
He is Jeff Essary. You can find his work at milehighreport.com and on Twitter at Jeffrey Essary. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Blue 58, hut!
Again, one more big thank you to Jeff Essary of milehighreport.com for joining us on the podcast today. Check him out at Jeffrey Essary on Twitter. He does some really good stuff for Denver. Really good, in-depth, thorough, authoritative breakdowns on defense, something that I think we're kind of lacking in the football non-professional media world. Authorities on defense are not as common as people who weigh in on offense. So it's good to have somebody like Jeff who's kind enough to join us today. I wanted to talk about something that I forgot to mention after Sunday's game, 2 uniform-related things that somehow didn't escape my notice, but escaped my mention in the post-game podcast. We've got to talk about Aaron Rodgers' wristband and the captain patches. The wristband is interesting to me, not from a function standpoint, just from a uniform standpoint, because this is a big departure for Aaron Rodgers and what he's done in his career. He hasn't worn something like this since he was at Cal. I have a hard time doing a take on it other than that one, that it looks interesting to see him wearing that wristband. As far as its function on the field, so what? So he wears a wristband. Who cares? Anything he can do to make the game faster and easier for himself and the rest of the offense seems like a pretty good idea. It was odd to me to see people get bent out of shape over that. And I don't understand what the pushback was there. If it helps him get the plays in faster, isn't that a good thing? And shouldn't he be doing whatever he can to get that done? And it doesn't even sound like he really used it all that often, and it wasn't really the plan for him to use it all that often anyway. And on top of that, other elite-level quarterbacks throughout the league use wristbands too. Russell Wilson wears one in Seattle. Tom Brady wears one in New England. I mean, come on. If those guys see it as a useful thing, why would you worry about Aaron Rodgers wearing it? The much more interesting thing out of those two is the captain patches. For the first time since this became a thing in, I think it was 2006, 2007, the Packers are going to be wearing permanent captain patches on their uniforms. I was against this when it first started because I thought it kind of cluttered up the Packers' look, and I've kind of come around to it, especially when you have someone like Aaron Rodgers, who has been a captain enough times that he has all of the stars and the big C on the patch filled in. It looks sharp. It adds a little bit of an extra individualization to somebody's uniform, which I think is good within reason. And it's kind of a cool part of Matt LaFleur's culture change here in Green Bay. He's added a few little different things. Look at the backdrop in news conferences. Look at the smoke coming out of the tunnel as players come onto the field. Dimming the lights after touchdowns during night games. Just trying to get people to get loud and stuff like that. That's cool. And all of these little things that he's doing are a part of the overall effort here in Green Bay. And I hope it's representative of a good overall effort. And it seems to be working so far. But I think it is interesting. And I think the Packers made 2 good choices in Aaron Rodgers and Zadarius Smith as their permanent captains. So I've got for you in this episode, we've got our traditional preview coming up on Friday, and then a busy week next week because the Packers play on Thursday night again against the Philadelphia Eagles. I do appreciate you listening. Again, big thanks to Jeffrey Essary for joining us on this particular episode, for giving us a little perspective on the Broncos. That was great stuff, and I hope you check out some of the stuff he's written for Mile High Report. If you like what you heard today and want to help us keep things going, the best way to support us is to leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help more people find the show. Taking your support to the next level, best way to do that is to go to patreon.com/thepowersweep and leave us $1 a month. That helps offset some of our costs here for hosting the site and the podcast. You can also check out our fine t-shirts and sweatshirts via our Teespring store. Click the shop link at thepowersweep.com to get your way over there. Any feedback, any thoughts, any questions you send our way, whether it's via Facebook, via Twitter, via email, whatever, helps us make this entire operation better because it helps us further our mission of helping everyone become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, Jon Meerdink. We will see you next time on Blue 58.